Someone was screaming for help over and over. This all went down during the winter of my 8th grade year. I was on the cusp of becoming a high schooler, and it was shaping up to be one of the best winters of my life. I had 2.5 months of no school until I officially entered high school, and I planned to make the most of it. Most of my time was spent playing video games, sleeping in, or playing basketball with my friends on the snow-covered courts. It was a typical teenager's dream. That winter, I found myself home alone for an entire week. My parents thought I could handle it. I was a relatively good kid and they trusted me, so it wasn't a big deal for our family. Plus, I had my cell phone, so if anything went wrong, I could call for help. My dad even gave me access to one of his credit cards for food in case I didn't want to eat what we had at home. I was stoked about having the house to myself. Some people told me it was pretty messed up for my family to leave me alone for that long, especially since I was barely 14. But I didn't see it that way. They didn't expect anything bad to happen, and neither did I. It was a rare occasion for them to be gone so long. This wasn't something they did often. In fact, I still live with my parents now, and I'm 19. Ever since that day, I haven't been home alone for more than 24 hours. It was a Friday night around 11 p.m. when my phone went off. I received a text from an unknown number that simply said, "Hey." I messaged back asking who it was. They became passive-aggressive, upset that I didn't recognize them. I apologized, explaining I'd lost all my contacts when I got a new phone a few months back. They still seemed upset, so I turned my phone on silent and continued playing PlayStation. About 10 minutes later, I heard a knock on my bedroom window. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but I decided to check. Peering through the blinds, I saw no one. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had indeed heard a knock. I checked the windows throughout the house, but there was nobody in sight. The silence of the snowy night only added to the eeriness. I took out my phone to call my mom and saw several messages from the unknown number. The most recent one read, "I'm here." My heart sank. I tried to call my mom, but my phone had no service, which was bizarre. We always had excellent cell reception at home. Terrified, I realized I was completely cut off. I wanted to message the person back, but I couldn't. I paced back and forth in the living room, jumping at every little sound. Suddenly, I heard noises outside. I ran toward the back patio and listened. Someone was screaming for help over and over. My heart raced. I thought it might be a setup, but I couldn't ignore the cries for help. Despite my fear, I decided to confront whoever was out there. I stepped onto the back patio, and everything went silent, except for the distant chirping of crickets.
"Hey, who's there?"
I yelled, trying to sound brave.
"Don't mess with me, man. You don't want to start something you can't finish."
Almost immediately, a bright light flashed at me from the distance. Our house sat on a large piece of land, and the backyard was vast, filled with trees. The light moved toward me, then suddenly turned off. The screaming resumed, more desperate than before.
Help me! Help!
I grabbed my old baseball bat from the garage and headed toward the woods where I'd seen the flashlight. My anxiety skyrocketed as I approached the dark silhouettes of the trees. About 30 feet ahead, I saw a shadowy figure.
"Hey, man, is that you?"
I called out, but there was no response. The figure then started running at me. In a split second, I turned and ran back to the house. I made it inside just in time, locking the sliding glass door behind me. The man was right there, pulling on the door. That's when I first stood face to face with this creep. He was tall, slender, and wore a wolf mask, holding a large hammer. I ran to my room, wondering why I hadn't defended myself with the bat, but fear had taken over. I tried my phone again, but still no service. I was furious, feeling like a victim in my own home. I waited, and soon enough he was knocking on my front door. I confronted him, telling him to see what would happen if he stepped inside. He just laughed. And let me tell you, I can't even begin to describe how that laugh sounded. You simply have to hear it for yourself, but it was the kind of laugh you'd expect in the creepiest of horror movies. I retreated to my room, and the knocking grew louder. Then I heard the living room window shatter. I hid behind my open bedroom door, bat in hand, ready to defend myself. I heard him downstairs, not grabbing any belongings, but moving with an eerie determination as if he was searching for me. Slowly, I heard him walking up the stairs. Every step felt like a knife stabbing into my heart. I couldn't believe I was in this situation. Even my nightmares weren't as terrifying as what was happening. First, he checked the bathroom, closing the door, and then proceeded to my parents' room. As he closed that door, the sound of his footsteps grew louder, approaching closer and closer until he was practically at my door. In that moment, I thought to myself, if this motherfucker takes one step inside, I'll fuck him up so hard, he'll wish he had never entered. I know it sounds extreme, but given the circumstances, it felt like the right response. Then, the moment arrived. He stepped into my room. He entered my room, and I struck him with the bat, knocking him to the ground. I hit him a few more times to ensure he wouldn't get up. I ran about 5 or 6 miles to my friend's house. They let me use their phone to call the police. The police arrived at my house and my friend's house. I called my parents, who were hours away. After the incident, I was taken to the police station for questioning. Sitting in that cold, sterile room, a sense of dread began to wash over me. The officers' questions started off routine, but as they delved deeper, I could feel something was really off. Then the bombshell dropped. They told me I had killed the man. Panic set in. I was still a minor, and the reality that I had taken someone's life, even in self-defense, was overwhelming. Yes, I killed a man as a minor. This fact haunts me to this day. The nightmares haven't stopped. They replay the blood, the screams, and that fateful moment over and over. I struggle with sleeping problems, waking up in cold sweats, haunted by the memories of that night. Every knock at the door sends a shiver down my spine, a jarring reminder of the terror I experienced. It all feels like it happened just yesterday, an ever-present reminder of that terrifying winter night. For privacy purposes, I won't mention any of our names in the story, but I must tell you that my older sister and I have had our fair share of scary encounters with the paranormal and supernatural over the years. My sister seems to have a sixth sense, or a third eye, as she can see ghosts. I sometimes catch glimpses of them too, out of the corner of my eye, along with sensing their presence. But that hasn't spared me from being scared out of my wits many times. Just before I turned 7, during a particularly harsh and snowy winter, my parents, my older sister, and I moved into an apartment building. It was only a 5-minute walk from where my mother worked, through streets often blanketed in thick snow. The apartment we moved into was on the ground floor, and the moment I first set eyes on the place, amidst the swirling snowflakes, I felt a deep sense of unease. I didn't voice my concerns at the time, but there was something dark and ominous about it, especially in the dead of winter. The atmosphere was heavy, the air inside felt colder than it should, and even the snow outside seemed to fall more heavily around our new home. I remember asking my mother why we couldn't just stay at our old apartment, which I loved, and she explained that it was scheduled to be demolished to make way for new restaurants. In our new home, I began to see a shadowy figure of a woman with wild hair out of the corner of my eye, especially when I was alone. The sightings became more frequent as the winter nights grew longer. I eventually mentioned her to my older sister once we were home alone, after she confessed that she didn't like our new house because there was something wrong with it. Her face turned pale when I told her about the figure. She confirmed that she had seen it too, and it always seemed to be peering around the corner at us. She had even seen it in broad daylight, a solid black figure that seemed to absorb the light, even when the weak winter sun shone through the drawn curtains. Weird and creepy things happened in that house, things my parents noticed too. The mildest occurrences were when we would come home to find the TV on and the taps in the kitchen and bathroom running full blast, despite us being sure we had turned everything off. Doors would open and slam shut on their own, adding to the chilling atmosphere of our snowy surroundings. Sometimes we heard a humming that sounded like it was from a little girl. However, my father, being the self-righteous control freak that he was, refused to believe us. He insisted that my sister and I were playing pranks, even though he knew we weren't. This often resulted in us facing his wrath. My father always called me a crybaby, especially when I showed fear of the dark, which seemed even more intense during the long winter nights. He would yell at me, bully me, and humiliate me, calling me a failure. I remember one winter night when I was 10, after a particularly nasty argument between my parents over one of my father's affairs, he stormed out into the snowy night. My mother was furious but broke down in tears once his car had disappeared into the winter storm. My sister and I tried to comfort her, but she sent us to bed, clearly embarrassed. We climbed into my parents' bed, leaving the bedroom door open. Barely 5 minutes later, the door slammed shut with a loud bang, and the lights flickered off. Terrified, I screamed, and my sister and I rushed to the door, only to find it wouldn't open. It felt as if something cold and unseen was holding it shut. We banged on the door, crying for our mother. Then we heard it, a sigh and a hiss from the darkness behind us. Finally, our mother opened the door, looking like an angel against the backdrop of the dimly lit hallway. We ran into her arms, and I broke down, gripping her tightly. She led us to the living room, where we huddled on the couch under a duvet. My sister recounted the terrifying events, including the hissing sound from the darkness. We spent that night together on the couch, the winter storm howling outside, as if echoing the unrest within our home. This is not where the story ends. So, 5 years later, when I was 12 years old, another harrowing experience occurred. Not long after my beloved mother was diagnosed with leukemia. The winter that year was particularly brutal, with frequent snowstorms that seemed to mirror the turmoil in our lives. It was during the winter break, so we were relishing the chance to sleep in. The world outside was blanketed in snow, transforming our neighborhood into a silent, frosty landscape. One cold December morning, around 8 a.m., my parents left for my mother's checkup. The snow was falling gently outside, adding to the thick layer that had already settled on the ground. I was asleep in my parents' bed, which is right next to the bunk bed my sister and I usually shared. My sister was asleep on the upper bunk, and it was barely 15 minutes after my parents had left when I heard a voice from the foot of my parents' bed. At first, I thought it was my older sister trying to annoy me, or get me to do something she was too lazy to do herself, so I didn't pay much attention and tried to go back to sleep. But then, something in the atmosphere shifted, and an ominous, demonic growl echoed from the foot of the bed. I've never moved so fast in my life. In a panic, I threw the covers off and scrambled up onto the upper bunk, finding my sister still asleep. My sudden arrival jolted her awake. Before she could scold me for waking her, we both heard the growling again, this time emanating from the spot on my parents' bed that I had just vacated. We felt like something was glaring at us, even though it was broad daylight and the room was otherwise empty. Huddled together under the blanket, we could sense the presence of whatever was there, watching us intently. The bedroom door, on the other side of the room, might as well have been miles away. We lay there in silence, the only sound the muffled howling of the winter wind outside. When our parents returned from the hospital, they found us shaking so badly we could barely speak. As we recounted what had happened, it was clear they were rattled by our fear and didn't leave us alone for the rest of the day. I remember clinging tightly to my mother for weeks afterward. When my older sister and I eventually talked about the encounter, she confessed that what had freaked her out the most was how pale our faces were and the sheer terror in my eyes. I was usually the braver one between us. Now, whenever I bring up that day, she becomes visibly upset and almost screams at me to never talk about it again. The memory of that winter morning, with its sinister growl and the feeling of being watched by an unseen presence, has stayed with us. It's a chilling reminder of the unseen and unexplained forces that sometimes intrude into our lives, especially during the long, dark days of winter.